that we could all use a little refreshment in the wilderness. We've decided that when we leave this place, we will truly be revived. I want to say, too, that part of the raison d'etre, if you will, of this service is a celebration of the completion of Lift Every Voice and Sing Too. And I just want to say what a great joy it's been to work with that committee. There is no other group in the church which is more talented and gifted than the people on that committee. We are blessed that they have worked assiduously and arduously to bring this child to term. And I must say that just like other pregnancies, we've had a few bouts of morning sickness here and there. And when you get opinionated musicians and clergy people together, well, what can I tell you? But the end result is a wonderful volume which will be in the hands of all the members of this church in just a few months. And finally, I want to say how grateful all of us are to Father Long and the members of St. Mary's for throwing open wide his gates and to welcome us here at St. Mary's this morning. And I'd be remiss, too, if I didn't especially thank Carl and Virginia Washington, who first offered St. Mary's and then told Father Long. And all the wonderful people who have given us, pun intended, a very warm welcome. Now, when it comes to the place of the Bible in the Episcopal Church, we have been spoiled. In the days of the 1928 prayer book, every lesson was printed in full, in the King James Version, of course, on lovely India paper between those sacred covers of Moroccan leather. Now, when the 1979 prayer book came along, and there were 3 cycles of lessons to contend with, and no end of authorized verses of Scripture, some thoughtful and entrepreneurial soul, knowing full well that Episcopalians would never countenance the idea of bringing Bibles to church, and being aware that the racks in the pews were full already with hymnals, prayer books, and of course copies of Lift Every Voice and Sing. That entrepreneurial soul invented that ubiquitous aid to worship known as the insert. And the insert enables us to maintain the time-honored tradition of following along with the readings. Now, the idea of simply listening never really caught on because we Episcopalians, knowing how important it is to keep up appearances, never pass up an opportunity to prove that we can read. Now, the problem with both systems is that we are often left woefully ignorant of that which precedes or follows the lectionary texts. Sometimes, as in today's Old Testament lesson, such ignorance leaves us at a decided disadvantage. For the plumb line is the last of 3 things which the Lord causes Amos to see, and we can understand its significance only if we bother to read the preceding verses to see what else the Lord placed in the prophet's line of vision and why. Amos's first vision was of a brood of locusts. To the farmer, of course, this spelled disaster. But the locusts which Amos saw were especially menacing because they came, he tells us, in the beginning of the shooting of the latter growth. That is, after the spring rains, when the crops would be at their peak. Amos's second vision was of a fire which followed a drought, which dried up even the underground springs. Now the earth had been twisted out of shape by all these tremors, these disappearing riverbeds and the like. It reminds me when I read of the earthquake that took place in Bishop Wilson's diocese a few months ago. It said people were paddling along in a kind of white river raft and so on. The earthquake came and the river changed its course. So they were going upstream and all of a sudden were going downstream. But sometimes life's like that too. So all of these things had an effect on the land, and so the buildings and the walls which the people had erected on the land were beginning to totter and were in danger of falling over. And so you see, the Lord in his wisdom shows Amos a plumb line. Now, I do not claim to be mechanical. In my house, we're still talking about the rheostat I installed about 10 years ago as a great accomplishment. So I had to look up plumb line. And the dictionary says a plumb line is a cord with a metal bob attached to one end used to determine perpendicularity. Now the plumber, he who plumbs, or the mason, or the architect, or whoever uses the plumb line, is engaged in the act of truing. Yes, truing is a verb. He is said to true. That is, to determine the trueness, not the truth, the trueness of the structure, and can thereby make predictions as to whether that structure can, for example, withstand the effects of an earthquake or should be raised. At other times, if he finds that the structure is not true, he can make the necessary adjustments. Now Amos, a farmer, would look at the locusts and the fire as the natural accompaniment of the precarious life of one who depends on the land for his living. But Amos was not just a simple farmer. He had been called to the prophetic office, and as a prophet, he sees far greater significance in those events. He sees them as signs and symbols of God's punishment on his faithless people. Amos sees in these signs impending catastrophe. The plumb line becomes then a tool of his prophecy, because with it he must test the trueness of the faith of God's people. But, my dear people, the plot thickens. Enter another member of the cast, whom we'll call Amazing Amaziah. The fact that Amos has appeared on the scene does not please Amaziah one bit. Amaziah's cover is blown. Amos is seen as a threat, and Amaziah treats him as many of us treat those who threaten us. He discredits him. He puts out some unfavorable press about him. He tells the king that Amos is not to be trusted and that his brand of prophecy will not further the cause of the kingdom. The land, he says, is not able to bear all his words. Amaziah, priest of Bethel, you see, is the court chaplain. He is a sycophant. He is a yes man. He is an expounder of civil religion. His job is to preach comfortable words to those happily ensconced in their comfortable pews. Above all, his role is to keep the status quo the status quo. The last thing he wants to do is to rock the boat. Now, Amos, on the other hand, makes it very clear that he does not come from a long line of prophets. He has no pedigree. He is a nobody, a dresser of sycamore trees, he tells us, whom the Lord in his wisdom has called to prophecy. He speaks for the people. He is not about uncritical patriotism or towing the line. He is not into making sure his speech is politically correct. He has no interest whatsoever in buttering up the right folks. He sells it like he buys it. He calls a spade a spade. The Lord has called him to denounce those who perpetrate injustices on the people of God, and Amos, therefore, is a champion not of civil religion, but of civil rights. My brothers and sisters in Christ, I would like to suggest to you this morning that these few verses in the book of Amos speak volumes to us who are gathered here for the 70th General Convention of the Episcopal Church. It is not an exaggeration to say that our beloved church in the last 3 decades or so has been shaken at her very foundations. She has been shaken so much that we have begun to wonder whether she is, speaking as a plumber, true. whether she can withstand the assaults of locusts who are intent on devouring the plantings of the godly people who have preceded them. We wonder if the church can survive the earthquakes which have shaken it at its foundation. We wonder whether the church will survive the fire which comes along and destroys everything in the twinkling of an eye. But Jesus Christ, who has promised to be faithful to his church until the end of the ages, Jesus Christ, who has promised that he would not leave us comfortless, has, because, as the hymn says, there is a wideness in God's mercy, God has raised up an Amos or two, plumb line in hand, and that all these Amoses, you see, are here to test, if you will, the perpendicularity of our beloved church, to see if she can stand on the land which has been besieged by so many disasters, a land rendered virtually unrecognizable in the wake of savage upheaval. For you may be certain, as the hymn reminds us, but still our ancient foe doth seek to work us woe, the devil has made sure that for every Amos the Lord sends, he will send an Amaziah with whom Amos must do battle. For the first 170 years or so of its existence, this church of ours, this church founded one afternoon, as has been suggested only partly in jest, by the same founding fathers who had drawn up the Constitution that morning, this church conducted business as usual. There was never a question as to what it was, or what or whom it represented. It was the church of the landed gentry. It was a church of the carriage trade, which meant that you came to church in a carriage, although some of us would have been driving those carriages, you see. It was a church of the elite. It is the church of the haves and not the have-nots. It was a church which the Vanderbilts, the Morgans, and the Roosevelts called their spiritual home. There's one of those apocryphal tales, you know, about J.P. Morgan, who was on the vestry of St. George's Church in New York City and resigned from the vestry because the rector had the temerity to propose for vestry membership a man who actually worked for a living, who used his hands. He could not see entrusting the governance of St. George's Parish to people who are accustomed to taking orders and not giving them, and besides, he couldn't possibly imagine receiving this man in his club or in his parlor. You see, although the Constitution would hold that Congress shall not establish a religion, the Episcopal Church has always been a pretty reasonable facsimile of an established church. If it can be said that American gentility was built upon the three-legged stool of church, school, and club, the Episcopal Church was always the church. Now, God from time to time has raised up prophets within the bosom of our church. Men like James Theodore Holly, who was totally ignored by the then presiding bishop, and went on anyhow with nary a dime in his hand to establish the Episcopal Church in Haiti. Men like George Freeman Bragg, who brought together the Conference of Church Workers among colored people, the precursor of the UBE. People like Holly Leroy Caution, who, it is interesting to note, and time you note, was successful in convincing the church at another time to change the venue of its general convention. But you see, the problem is that these men were often dismissed, placated, or patronized, or ways were found to lessen their impact. It was not until prophets arose from without, in a society in which the church was so integral a part. It was not until the terrain of the land had begun to shift irreversibly that we began to see action. The black civil rights movement of the 60s, which served to embolden women's liberationists, which in turn paved the way for the gay rights movement, have all struck at the heart of the power structure of the Episcopal Church, which has been for nearly 200 years quite male, and for all intents and purposes, straight. What we are witnessing today, as the General Convention grapples with issues having to do with human sexuality, inclusive language, and racism, can be seen as a pitched battle between the Amoses and the Amosinas and the Amaziahs on the other hand. The one group pressing for justice on behalf of those members of Christ's body who have been disenfranchised, dejected, and disappointed. The other retrenching their ranks, guarding their turf, all the while reciting those 7 deadly words of the Episcopal Church: we have always done it that way. I would like to suggest this morning that the Amaziahs of the church have been hoisted on their own petard. They are learning the hard way that they cannot hold back a movement which is of God. This General Convention purports to honor Martin Luther King, and we will reserve for another sermon the way in which it purported to do that. A man who was killed because it was felt that his death would stop the movement. But the assassins had not read Tertullian, who wrote Sanguis Martyrorum Semen Ecclesiae. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. So far from destroying the movement, you actually give it life. Likewise, the racist church which tried to placate its black members by establishing suffragette bishops for colored work should have known that that was only a foot in the door, and that the day would come when people like John Burgess and Horace Walker and Herb Thompson would lead dioceses as bishops for all of God's people. A church which throws a bone to women and confers upon them what the prayer book used to call the inferior office of the diaconate should have known the day would come when Barbara Harris would sit in the House of Bishops. A church which says in one convention, read my lips, that homosexuals are children of God, entitled to the pastoral ministrations of the church, cannot feign surprise when at another convention gays say, well, if we're all right, then bless our lifestyle. And a church which has gone to great pains to emphasize, on the one hand, the priesthood of all believers, and on the other has, as it were, declericalized the clergy. A church whose catechism says that the ministers of the church are lay people, bishops, priests, and deacons, cannot now with integrity, pun very much intended, demand different moral standards of the clergy than it does of its laity. You see, the church for too long has been a non-profit PHET organization. And the church has responded to the Amoses whom God has raised up, and things have begun to change. Presiding Bishop Hines dropped a plumb line at the General Convention in Seattle in 1967 to test the church's trueness when it came to sharing her wealth, and the General Convention special program was born. Jomo Kenyatta dropped the plumb line, and I might add a bomb, at the General Convention, the Special General Convention in South Bend in 1969, when he wrested the microphone from the same presiding bishop and demanded that the church pay reparations to its black members. A plumb line was dropped in 1970 as the church's trueness was tested as relates to its sexism, and women deputies were seated at the General Convention for the first time, and women were allowed to be ordained deacon. 6 years later in Minneapolis, that same plumb line was dropped a little further, and the priesthood was open to women. Time and time again, a plumb line has been dropped, and corrections have accordingly been made to the church's structure to respond to the demands of all sorts and conditions of men and women. And at this 70th General Convention, Bishop Browning is again dropping a plumb line in an attempt to true the church as regards her racism. And we wonder if indeed the church will be able to bear all of his words. Now, you may well be asking, what has all of this to do was lift every voice and sing. What do we, black Episcopalians, who, let it be known, can be just as elitist, just as snobby, and far more bougie than our white counterparts, what have we to offer the church when it comes to music? Let me read you something. Somebody visited Episcopal church and listened to the choir, and this is what they said. I had in the forenoon, that means morning, visited a Negro church belonging to the Episcopal creed. There were but a few present, and they were of the Negro aristocracy of the city. The mode of conducting divine service was quiet, very proper, and a little tedious. The hymns were beautifully and exquisitely sung. These words were written in 1850, but they could be written in 1950 or 1990. But you see, the civil rights movement has tended to liberate black Episcopalians too. And we have learned that we need not leave our blackness at the door. And that we can have, you see, the best of both worlds. We can have the great, rich Anglican heritage and the great, rich black heritage. We can, you see, have Amazing Grace and incense. So what has all this to do with lift every voice and sing? I would like to suggest a little more than meets the eye. In offering this hymnal for the church, it is far more than 300 hymns and a few mass settings. It is music which represents the experience of a people who have been rebuked and scorned. The opinions of a certain Supreme Court nominee notwithstanding, black people, even those black Episcopalians who have the outward and visible signs, the trappings of success, know what it means to suffer, know what it means to be discriminated against, and know full well, even in the bosom of the church, what it means when people put us in what they deem to be our place. We know what it means to bump into that sometimes not too invisible ceiling. What we offer to the church through this music is nothing less than our own spirituality. Now, spirituality is all the rage these days. I was at my seminary dinner last night, but I integrated it. And Berkeley has established to James an incentive for spirituality. Other places you get a PhD in spirituality now. But you see, black people are people who did not have to learn spirituality. Spirituality is part and parcel of our existence. It is in every sinew of our bones. And it is not for naught that our folk songs sung in the midst of apparent hopelessness have been called what? Spirituals. Members of the majority culture have been taught to believe that wealth, success, and children who rise up and call them blessed are their due. To black people, we have learned that these are privileges achieved at great price. So when things do not go well, our first reaction is not, why me? We sing instead, when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll. Whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. Those of us who have historically not been blessed with an abundance of this world's goods have known without being taught in a spirituality seminar that our hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood, his righteousness. For a people for whom suffering has been our meat day and night, there was no need for a therapist to charge us a handsome fee for the privilege of telling us that we shouldn't keep it all bottled up. We knew intuitively to take it to the Lord and leave it there. While others recited and firmly believed William Ernest Henley's Invictus, which began with those lofty but theologically suspect words, out of the night that covers me, dark as a pit, from pole to pole. I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul, and ended on that triumphal note of rank heresy. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. We have always known that we could ill afford the luxury of depending on our own inadequate resources to survive the changes and chances of this mortal life. So instead, we have sung, I am weak, and I need thy strength and power to help me over my weakest hour. Help me through the darkness thy face to see. Lead me, O Lord, lead me. My friends, I need not remind you that all is not at ease in Zion. The mighty have indeed been put down from their seats, and those who raked in 7 digits in the 80s find themselves on soup lines today. The church has not escaped the financial crisis facing this nation, and although the faithful are giving more than ever in the collection plate, expenses are eating up those offerings, and drastic measures are being taken. The irony is that as we launch a decade of evangelism, we may well find that we can barely have the funds to keep our own parish church doors open. And as the church becomes polarized over the issues which beset us, and as some of the faithful, it is rumored, are voting with their pocketbooks, you see poverty, deprivation, hunger, despair have left their calling cards at the homes of those who truly believe themselves to have been immune from such adversity. Well, the plumb line, my good people, has been dropped in our midst once again. Our faith, our endurance, our future as a Christian community, our witness to the world, our ability to bring others to Christ, our mutual tolerance are all being tested. They are all in the balance. And as we redouble our efforts to preserve this church for its mission and ministry, and some would even say rescue it from the brink of schism, we all need that blessed assurance that there is indeed a balm in Gilead. I am not suggesting for a moment that lift every voice and sing too will be the great panacea. But I am suggesting that as all of us who march upward to Zion, the whole church will find new meaning in the words which have been for so long familiar to many of us. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died, yet with a steady beat. Have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed? We have come over a way that with tears have been watered. We have come treading our feet to the blood of the slaughters. Out of our gloomy past, till now we stand at last where the white gleam of a bright star is cast. And the Lord said to me, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a plumb line. And now to God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, we ascribe as is most justly due all honor, might, majesty, dominion, and power, henceforth, now, and forever. Amen.